serious summer school for global governance. It's an annual exercise run by a German foundation, the Zeit Foundation, that actually brings young leaders from around the world. For them, it's under 40. And they're very, very ambitious in that the people around the table are usually people of very, very high distinction already before they come to this summer school. And people like me were invited to advise them, instruct them on principles of global governance. So I went there and lectured every summer. It was a break for me from my UN duties. And one year, I think it was 2005, one of the students amongst the group of bright young achievers was a certain Rahul Gandhi. So that was the kind of level at which that fun. So when this went on for some time, they asked me, don't you think we could do an Asian version of this? So I said, yes, but you'll need an Asian partner. So I said, why don't they try in India? And after a couple of unsuccessful forays, I stumbled across the idea of going to the Observer Research Foundation. Ever since, we have been doing this Asian Forum on Global Governance. Meanwhile, I had returned to India for good, and I became the dean of it. So every year, for about 1 week and 2 weekends, we invite about 50 young people from around the world. For us, it's under 35 rather than under 40, because we don't aim for the Rahul Gandhis, and we've even had ministers and so on, but we get relatively early starting people to come and we talk to them from an Indian perspective about these issues. So Samir and I know each other for over 10 years of running this thing, where I was the dean and he was the principal host, as it were, from the ORF. And we said, why not try and make a book out of what we've been talking about? Now, what we've done here is, as I said, genuine co-authorship, with the exception of one chapter which I wrote the first draft of and he wrote. Otherwise, the deal was, I'm very busy, I've got Parliament, I've got all my headaches. You do the first draft of a chapter, send it to me, and I will make corrections, subtractions, changes, and additions, send it back to you. You agree, that we move on to the next chapter. And in that way, for someone like me who's been had a very hectic last couple of years, as you know, the lead up to the Lok Sabha elections, the election themselves, and the immediate aftermath have been quite fraught. It was inconceivable to write a book from scratch any other way. So I'm very grateful. I don't want to make a habit of co-authoring, but this time it worked very well. And not everything there is what Samir would agree with, and not everything there is what I would agree with. We have tried to come to a true meeting of minds on these larger issues.
So coming to a meeting of minds and taking you back to what you first spoke, India has a very strong network of partnerships. And you also mentioned that India is a rule taker, and we want it ideally to move into it being a rule maker. So is this a strong Indian sentiment that you are trying to start? Or is it a case of flossy, nosy, nihilification?
No, listen, flossiness and nihilification merely is a made-up word talking about estimating somebody or something as worthless. And I don't think any of this is worthless. For example, I think the global governance arrangements that were arrived at in 1945 did a lot of good, right? Because there's been no World War III, for one thing. They were able to keep global peace. They were able, in many ways, to preside over an era of decolonization, where the majority of the world's peoples flung off the colonial yoke, and development became the new buzzword, and some of the former colonizers took some responsibility for assisting development, etc. So lots of good things happened, international treaties, international agreements, lots of positive things in the world. At the same time, not everything was as positive as it should be. First of all, there were winners and there were losers, and by and large, the winners were the rich developed countries and the losers were the rest of us. So when, for example, we talk about peace and security, yes, there was a peace for a very long time in Europe, but a lot of conflict was exiled to the periphery. So countries like ours, many countries in Africa, Latin America, elsewhere, endured pretty bad conflict. And to tell them, you tell today the people of Syria, or parts of Libya, or parts of Iraq, that we are living in a great era of global peace, as Samira was suggesting, obviously they would look totally bewildered because their lives are hell today, which they weren't when Europe was at war. So there's one example. Another would be issues like climate change, right? These Western countries have developed with complete disregard for the environment. Today they've woken up to the fact that the environment is under threat, and they want the rest of us to behave and to stop polluting and so on and so forth. Now, obviously as an Indian, I don't want to live with the consequences of climate change, but equally I'm very conscious that Indians, or 250 million Indians, are unable to take for granted what any Irishman or Icelander can do, which is they can walk into a room and flick a switch on the wall and find themselves bathed with light. We can't do that for many of our people. So there are still basic challenges to be overcome in providing such things to people that will in turn involve some emissions. But where you look at India as a country with 17% of the world's population, and we're generating 4% of the emissions. You look at America with 5% of the world's population generating 27% of the emissions. And apparently they're the virtuous ones, and we are the villains of the piece, because we have all these coal-fired thermal plants spewing stuff into the air. Somewhere or the other, a balance has to be struck and solutions found that are fair to everybody. So these are the kinds of issues. There are many, many other issues in the book, but just to give you a couple of examples of the kinds of ways in which what seemingly has worked, and which I myself as a UN official would talk about how the international system has worked well for the world. Nonetheless, there are people on the world for whom it could work better, and that's what this is about.
Shashi, you worked at the UN between 1978 and 2007, 2008. 2007. You've seen it up close in many different ways.
Yeah.
Looking back, what do you think has worked for the UN as an organization, and where are the areas you feel it's failed? You've covered a lot of that in the book, but I'd like you to share that with the audience.
Well, I think one thing that worked, many of you will probably agree, is that when there was this awful Cold War superpower standoff, when literally anything might have ignited another global conflagration, at that time, the UN was able to provide a mechanism to prevent that happening. And, for example, the invention by Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld of the whole concept of peacekeeping, which was actually never foreseen in the UN Charter. The UN Charter was written up by the allies of World War II, and they assumed they'd stay allied. So the US and the Soviet Union were on the same side, and they wrote a charter under which their generals would meet and keep peace around the world. But when the Cold War came and they were on opposite sides, that was no longer possible. So instead, countries like India, Ireland, Fiji, you had Sweden and so on, they started providing troops to the UN under Hammarskjöld's initiative to keep the peace in conflict areas where, if the peace had not been kept, the conflict could have drawn in the superpowers and ignited a major war. So that's something, for example, that I thought the UN did rather well. And rightly, it won the Nobel Peace Prize for that effort, quite remarkably. Another thing the UN did very well was humanitarian work. I spent the first 11 years of my UN career with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, dealing with some of the most intractable problems of Vietnamese boat people crisis. We went through the Afghan refugee crisis. We had the Central American refugee crisis after the war in Salvador, the Horn of Africa crisis, and before my time, of course, the Bangladesh crisis, when the largest single refugee movement in human history, 10 million Bengalis fled the Pakistani forces in East Pakistan, came over to us. So all of these things, the UN was able to step in and help contain, help resolve. And one good thing about the UN is when the UN deals with a problem, you don't have to worry about some country's political agenda being pushed. You see these crises and these bags of relief coming saying gift of the United States of America and so on, and you feel, oh my gosh, how humiliating that we have to get this. Whereas when the UN's flag flies, everyone has a stake in it, everyone belongs to the UN, and UN assistance, even though it may have come from the same rich countries, is something that everyone can equally feel proud about. I think that worked rather well as well. Development worked in a middling way, but at least the development agenda was there. The message was given that people have an obligation to help countries develop. So those are the things. Treaties. The UN became the place to negotiate all sorts of international treaties and agreements. And one more thing is the agenda setting function. Every major issue we're conscious of today started off at some point in a UN conference. For example, we're all much more conscious of the environment today. And we weren't, right? So in the 70s, the first, I think 73, the UN organized a conference in Stockholm on the environment. And Indira Gandhi went there and spoke for India and so on. And became the first time that the world actually focused collectively on the planetary challenge that environmental damage represented. And then you had Rio in 92, you've had Tokyo, you had various processes since, most recently Mexico, which didn't actually do so well. But the idea is that the UN can set the agenda and oblige every country in the world to participate in a discussion of what this is all about. So all of those things I would say would work. And, they were pretty adaptable. If I had told my seniors at the UN when I joined it in 1978 that I thought I was joining an organization which would one day impose sanctions on the entire import-export trade of a member state, an organization that would one day take over political control of an entire country and run elections there, an organization that would set up an international criminal court to try sometimes heads of state, former heads of state, for crimes against their own citizens in a foreign country far away. If I'd mentioned any of those things, I think my seniors, since it was the 1970s, they would have asked me, "Hey Shashi, what are you smoking?" This was not what anyone understood the UN to be at that time, and yet in the course of my career, the UN did all of those things and more. So the fact is that the ability to adapt and adjust to changing demands in the world has also featured positively for the UN. So when I ran for Secretary General, my message was, yes, we need to reform the UN, not because it's lousy, but because it's done well enough to be worth reforming, to do even better in the future. And that's the sort of thing I think one could.
But the US didn't want you, they vetoed you, right? They sent a message through the ambassador saying, we don't want a strong Secretary General.
Yeah, it was rather disloyal of their ambassador to report that in his memoir, but yeah, that's what he says he got. So no strong Secretary General, and we know what happened. But, looking back, I did what I had to do, and I believe that one picks oneself up and moves on. I kind of felt that I'd spent my whole life in preparation for that because I had really an unusual UN career in that I'd done every single one of the major activities of the UN. I began with humanitarian work, refugees, spent time in the Security Council, handled peacekeeping, ran the largest operation in Yugoslavia, ended up in management, worked in the Secretary General's office for an entire term, then ended up in management, so dealing with budget, personnel, reform, pruning staff, all of that stuff. So I'd done pretty much everything, and I thought, somehow this was fated. But fate had other plans. and so you sort of realize at the end of the day, you do something because you feel it's what you're meant to do. But if it turns out not to work out, that isn't the end of the world. You've got to pick up and find something else to do. And I found it here. I remember meeting your mother, Margaret Alva, when she came to the United Nations in the very late 80s or early 90s. She'd come as a part of the General Assembly delegation. We got along like a house on fire. And we saw each other on her frequent visits thereafter. Little did I realize that one day I would be following her into her party politics in India. It was farthest thing from my mind. But because it's done well enough to be worth reforming, to do even better in the future. And that's the sort of thing I think one could.
But the US didn't want you, they vetoed you, right? They sent a message through the ambassador saying, we don't want a strong Secretary General.
Yeah, it was rather disloyal of their ambassador to report that in his memoir, but yeah, that's what he says he got. So no strong Secretary General, and we know what happened. But, looking back, I did what I had to do, and I believe that one picks oneself up and moves on. I kind of felt that I'd spent my whole life in preparation for that because I had really an unusual UN career in that I'd done every single one of the major activities of the UN. I began with humanitarian work, refugees, spent time in the Security Council, handled peacekeeping, ran the largest operation in Yugoslavia, ended up in management, worked in the Secretary General's office for an entire term, then ended up in management, so dealing with budget, personnel, reform, pruning staff, all of that stuff. So I'd done pretty much everything, and I thought, somehow this was fated. But fate had other plans. and so you sort of realize at the end of the day, You do something because you feel it's what you're meant to do. But if it turns out not to work out, that isn't